Amen. Well, here we go. um, this, apart from the resurrection, is the only miracle that's found in all four of the Gospels. What does that tell us?
It really happened.
It's important. It's important. It's really important. I'm going to go into some detail about backgrounds and stuff like that because I think it helps us understand. So who would like to read verses 1 through 9 for me? Go for it, Marilyn.
I'm reading from the New American Standard. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias, and a great multitude was following him because they were seeing the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Jesus, therefore, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a great multitude was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread that these may eat?" And this he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people?"
Thanks. The timing of this, John says sometime after this, he's talking about sometime after the previous section, which would have been the healing of the invalid at the pool. Now, it's kind of important because it kind of helps us see the progression in Jesus's ministry. We don't know when that previous event took place. All Jesus said, or all John says, is it was time for a feast of the Jews, and it's usually one of two. John kind of helps us understand timing by giving us feasts. If it was the Feast of Tabernacles, it would have been 6 months later. If it was the Feast of Passover, it would have been a year later. So sometime between 6 months and a year after that healing, John fast forwards to the next Pentecost, or to the next Passover, excuse me. It also kind of places it a year before Jesus's death. So he's been going around for 2.5 years, somewhere in there. We're not really quite sure because John doesn't tell us what that first feast he was talking about is. But what we're doing now is starting a countdown clock. So we see that Jesus has been around for a while. People are watching, they're hearing, and they're following him because of the miracles he'd performed. They're not following him because they believe he's the Messiah. John says they're following because they had watched him do all these miracles. So it's gotten their attention, we'll put it that way. That's going to change. We're going to see in a little bit that their whole purpose for following Jesus is shifting and changing. But at least for now, they're seeing that here's a guy that can do things that nobody else can do. They're starting to link him with some of the prophets from the past. In fact, there's questions about, is he, quote unquote, the prophet, the one that they had talked about coming before the Messiah? Nobody's quite made that total connection yet, but many people are on the way. But there's this big crowd that's following. And so Jesus asked that question. He says, where shall we buy bread for them to eat? Now you're out in the middle of nowhere. There's not a lot of huge towns with big bakeries and supermarkets around. So Jesus asked this question, knowing full well what he's going to do. But we see two totally different responses when presented with a problem. The first one was Philip saying, 8 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for these people to even get a bite. In other words, he has that pessimistic view. Here's a problem. I don't know what we're going to do about it, but okay, here we are. Contrast that with Andrew, who actually looked for some solution. He looked around and he found somebody that had some fish and some bread. And he brought that to Jesus. And that contrast is fun. Because what's our response when we're faced with an issue? Are we like Philip? Do we throw up our hands and say, this is hopeless? Or do we at least look around and see what we have and bring it to Jesus? And sometimes we do both, folks, honestly. Sometimes our initial human response is, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then we come to Jesus. Now, I've been saying all along through this study that Jesus isn't really doing anything new yet. He's doing a lot of things that the prophets before him had done, including this. This should have been a reminder for his disciples who knew the scriptures. And Susan, would you like to read that passage for me? This is from 2 Kings.
I can unmute. All right. A man came from Baal Isha, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give to the men that they may eat. But his servant said, how am I to set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord.
Thanks. So feeding a large group of people with very little has already been done. But it all hinged on doing it according to what the Lord had said. And Elisha knew that. He knew that God would provide. Jesus knew that God would provide. And he wants to show that to his disciples. Remember, this is a section in Jesus's ministry where he's starting to shift gears a little bit. He's starting to look towards the end. And he's starting to really focus on showing his disciples, those apostles, especially the 12, here is what is possible. And here's what you're going to be doing when I'm gone. He hasn't said that yet, but he's starting to plant those seeds. And so the shift here, yes, he's going to feed a huge crowd, but the focus isn't so much on the crowd as it is on his followers, especially the 12. Who would like to read verses 10 through 15 for me, please? Vita, go for it.
Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, So the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign which he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself.
Thanks. We call this the feeding of the 5,000 because that's the number of men that were present. That's how they just counted crowds in those days. There's also going to be women. There's also going to be children there. If you even just conservatively estimated a woman and a child with each man, you're going to have 15,000 people. Could be even more. I've heard estimates between 15 and 20,000 people. It's basically going into the Target Center, the XL Center, and having it full to capacity and taking 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish and give everybody something to eat. That's kind of the numbers that we're looking at. But the other thing, how much did everybody have to eat? Anybody?
As much as they wanted.
As much as they wanted. Yeah. Think about that. Giant crowd, very limited resources, and everybody got as much as they wanted. Not just a nibble, not just a sniff, as much as they wanted. What does that tell us about Jesus when he provides?
He does it abundantly.
Abundant. I love that word. Abundantly. Actually, he does it overabundantly because there was what? Leftovers. To me, this is one of the neatest parts about this whole thing. How many baskets of leftovers were there?
Oh,
5.
12.
12.
So,
How many apostles were there?
wow.
At that time,
12. 12. Each one of those guys would be holding one of those baskets. And they're going to have a little bit of time in a boat after Jesus is gone. And they're going to be sitting there in that boat talking about what they just saw and looking down, and they got a basket of leftovers in front of them. You think that's going to stir some conversation? Yeah. They don't know it yet. But Jesus is teaching them what it's going to be like for them as well. But they saw Jesus do this miraculous sign. And suddenly now, Jesus is concerned. Because now they're thinking he's the prophet. Now, you go back to Deuteronomy, and Moses is kind of sort of, somebody's kind of, is that me making the noise? The people were afraid when they were gathered with Moses and the mountain was shaking and it was rumbling and God was speaking in this booming voice. The people asked Moses, "Hey, we don't want to hear this anymore. This is scary." So God told Moses, "Okay, I will no longer appear to the people as this big, scary entity." You know, I imagine them gathering around the base of the mountain, and it's like a volcano erupting, and it's smoke and it's fire and this booming voice. And it was scaring the people. And so God says, "Okay, Moses, when you're gone, I will send prophets, and they will speak on my behalf. Instead of God speaking directly to the people, he would speak to a person who would then relay that message. At first, that person was Moses, and then it was going to be other people that God would use. Well, that had kind of gotten blown out of proportion. And suddenly now, over time, the Jewish people, especially the religious leaders, had said, God is going to send the prophet. Not just a prophet, but the prophet, the one who was going to come heralding the coming of the Messiah. And that's who the people were starting to think Jesus was. They'd asked John the Baptist if he was the prophet, and he flat out denied it. He says, no, I'm the voice of the one calling in the wilderness, the one that Isaiah had talked about. They asked Jesus if he is the prophet. The people were expecting something else. But what they saw in Jesus was something different. This guy could do things that they'd only heard about in their Bible study stories in the past. Their religious leaders couldn't do what Jesus could do. So they saw him as being somebody from God, somebody powerful, and we want this guy as our leader. And Jesus knew that. He knew that they weren't going to rest until they, by force, made him king. Now, could they have done that? Really, honestly, could the people have forced Jesus to do something they didn't want to do?
No.
No. But what would the fallout of that been? It might have been pretty ugly. So instead of standing and fighting and facing down the people, Jesus did something that I think is absolutely fascinating. He simply walked away. Boy, can we learn from that. Instead of fighting battles that we know we're never going to win unless there's carnage, he simply walked away. Now, this wasn't the first time that a religious leader had done something like that. We go back to the story of King David. And he gets word that his son Absalom is coming to overthrow him. And David had the choice. He could have stayed and fought, but instead he gathered followers and he left. He left town. He wasn't going to fight a battle because it would have been ugly. Jesus did the same thing. Instead of staying to fight the people, he simply walked away. And I love how so many times in his ministry, he simply walks away and goes off to be alone with God. Can we learn from that too? Yeah. So much so that this was nothing new to his disciples, to that group of 12. Who would like to read verse 16 through, now let's go all the way to 24 for me. Sharon?
Sure. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading.
Let's stop
And
there
that's
for a
it.
moment. Let's stop there for a moment. They didn't even wait. Jesus was gone. They just get in the boat and take off without him. That shows me that this is something that's happened frequently in the past, that they didn't just sit around and go, gee, I wonder where he is. Should we wait for him? No, they just got in the boat and took off across the lake. I like that. And remember, they're taking off across the lake, each one of them holding this basket of leftovers. Again, great time for conversation. Now, John doesn't go into a lot of detail about what transpired, but he does give us some. They're about halfway across the lake. Now, they're in this boat and they're rowing it. Imagine a boat that's probably about 20, 21 feet long. It has a sail, and it also has oars. And they're out there, and they're not huge boats, but they're big enough. But it's dark, and it's a storm. Now, these guys were fishermen. They were used to being on the water at night, because that's when you would fish. You'd go out at night and you would fish. As the fish came in shallow to feed, that's when you toss your nets out. But having a storm blow up at night was a little unique. Now, you kind of have to visualize this. The Sea of Galilee is roughly the size of Lake Mille Lacs. Kind of sort of the same shape. And it's a bowl. It's kind of shallow on the shores, and then it comes down a little bit deeper in the middle. And they're out towards the middle. But it's also surrounded by hills and mountains. But what they called mountains weren't really huge mountains. They were just more tall hills. And so when the wind would come up, first of all, you wouldn't know it till the storm was right on top of you because you couldn't see over the top of the hills. But secondly, it'd start to swirl around in that little valley, in that bowl shape there, and the waves could get pretty tall. So you're in a small boat, you're struggling against it, and you're trying to figure out, how are we going to get to the other side? Are we even going to make it to the other side? And then you look up, and what do you see? You see Jesus walking across the water, coming to you. And what was their response when they saw that?
They were afraid.
They were afraid. Yeah, I think I would be too. Because first of all, you don't really recognize who it is. You just see somebody walking out on top of the water. And I think it was Matthew that said they thought they were seeing a ghost. But Jesus simply says, it's me. Don't be afraid.
You know, if I can say something, I'm kind of bothered by the fact that they just up and left Jesus. Because they're his followers, you know? And I just don't understand why they thought they could leave and just leave him behind.
Because they knew he'd be okay. It tells me, and we see this in other places, that this happened quite frequently. That Jesus, especially after a big event, would quite often go by himself to be alone with God. And they just knew where they were going. And they knew that Jesus would get there somehow.
Okay. If I was a disciple, I'd stay there and wait for him.
I would probably do that too. And it probably happened the first couple of times. And Jesus probably said, no, guys, just go on without me. Because remember, he's been with them now for a while. And they just understand how things work. And we could learn from that. Because the longer we follow Jesus, the longer we've been walking with him, the more we too start to understand this is just how things are. This is just how it works. So we don't have to get so bent out of shape. We don't have to be so hung up on things. We can simply go on knowing that he'll show up when he's supposed to show up. He'll meet us. Yeah, Diane.
Well, I'm with Helen. I would have probably waited. And then as you were talking, I got thinking, and I realized that had they waited for Jesus, they would have had a heck of a time walking on the water, or trying to be God, or trying to take care of things in God's way. So there's an element of humility about, well, you know, I'm not God and I can't fix this. And so maybe I should just stand back and be me and trust God to fix the rest of it.
I'm going to borrow that next time I preach on this passage. Because that is so true. That is so true. Excuse me. I love it though, how he shows up in the midst of a storm and simply says, it's me, don't be afraid. And the brilliant part is they had the wisdom to listen and take him into the boat. Because John says, then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. That's kind of cool when you think about it. But it only happened that way because they were willing to let him into the boat. If we're going to take that analogy and kind of apply it to modern day life, we get thrown into storms all the time. Life can get difficult. It can take a variety of means, whether it's something going on physically with us or somebody we love. You know, you just have to read the news and realize that there's storms all around us. And Jesus is coming to us in that time saying, don't be afraid. What's our response? Do we let him in to be with us through that time, to be God? Or do we make him walk along the side of the boat? It's like, we want you near us, Jesus, but we're not quite willing to let you come all the way in. And how often do we do that? Think about it. Yes, Susan.
I was driving out of town, and I hadn't been on the road even 5 minutes, and huge hailstorm hit. And then I kept saying, I'm going to turn around. But each time I came to a place where I could turn around, the sun was out. And so I kept going. And then I ran into like an apartment building on fire. And then I ran into semi trucks that had blown together in the wind and both tipped over on the side of the highway. So the traffic was backed up. And especially in the early part of it, when I was in the really bad hailstorm and the sky was just black. And I was on the way to a Curcio meeting. So I was kind of in a spiritual mood anyway. I just pushed everything off the passenger seat of the car and said, Jesus, you can come sit here. I need you right now.
Well, it's better than moving over there yourself and say, here, Jesus, you drive.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Did he help?
She's here talking about it.
And the sun kept coming down. So I got to my destination.
And that kind of goes hand in hand with what the responses were of Philip and Andrew when presented with the problem. Philip just said, I don't know what to do. Andrew at least said, here's what we got, and brought it to Jesus. And the disciples here kind of had that same choice. They saw somebody walking out on the top of the water in the middle of a storm, and then they heard his voice. And that voice says, don't be afraid. They were smart enough to listen. Quite often, in the midst of those storms in life, we may be wanting Jesus to come, but are we listening? Are we listening? Can we hear him when he comes and says, don't be afraid? Kind of goes back to, I think, Diane, you talked about it last week, where we don't know how to not listen or think our way through things. It's like we don't really understand what it means to hear it with our hearts. Because quite often we're too busy talking. Now, I like to think of prayer as a conversation. If I had conversations with somebody and it was only them talking to me continually, I think that would get old. Because you don't have any opportunity to interact. It really becomes listening to a monologue. And I think that's one of the struggles we have, especially as 21st century Americans. We like to live in our heads. And so when we come to the Lord, we spend a whole lot more time talking and not enough time listening. And I think it's especially true in those hard times. I've been around so many people who just keep coming over and 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 praying, and their hearts are in the right place. They really want to bring that problem to Jesus. But they don't stop talking long enough to listen to what he's trying to say. He's patient. He'll wait. Sometimes he'll wait until we are so totally exhausted that we have nothing left to give. But he'll wait. And eventually, when we finally give up, that's when he can move. And one of the tricks is to learn early on to listen to that voice as it's calling. And I see from this encounter that those disciples had learned to listen for Jesus's voice. They recognized somebody coming, but they heard his voice, and immediately things got better. That's one of those things, by the way, that I'm kind of curious to see how that played out. It's one of the questions I want to ask. It's like, how'd that happen? How was that? So that's just a continuation of the miracle part, but I think it's kind of cool. Okay, who would like to read 22 through 24 for me, please? Susan?
On the next day, the people who remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. However, boats from Tiberias came near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the people saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum seeking Jesus.
Thanks. In other words, the crowd realized that there had only been one boat. They saw the disciples get in it. They didn't see Jesus get in it. So now they wanted to figure out, where did this guy go? Because now they were curious, but they were also going to seek him for the wrong reason. So who would like to read 25 through 27 for me? short little passage.
I'll do it.
Thanks, Helen.
When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them, very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal. Is that how far
Thanks.
you want?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Notice the shift. They were following him at first because they saw the miracles, they saw the healings, they saw how he was touching people. And now their focus and purpose has shifted. They just want a free lunch. That's it.
Yeah.
They were no longer curious in Jesus, the miracle worker. They were now looking for Jesus who was going to just give them free food, give them their fill. And Jesus calls them on it. He says, don't look for the food that spoils, but look for the stuff that leads to eternal life. But man, how many times do we see that happen? That people come to Jesus and they're first curious about who he is. And they hear the stories and they want to know more about this guy who can raise people to life. But then over the course of time, that shifts and it becomes more about, hey, Jesus, what can you do for me? I had somebody describe it once as they see Jesus as a giant spiritual vending machine.
Mm.
You put your prayer in, hit the button, and see what comes out. And that's the only reason that they come. It's not, what can I bring in worship, but what am I going to get out of this relationship? It's a totally different way of approaching the Lord. It's a totally different relationship. Again, it goes back to when we're praying, is it all about us? Is it all about me just telling Jesus not only what I need, but how he should do it? Or is it about me having a conversation and listening to what he's trying to speak? And it's the same way here. What is the purpose for following him? And remember, the people who he's talking to, first of all, are the crowds, the multitudes. We're going to be bouncing back and forth between faith and disbelief all through this time. But on the deeper level, he's using this as an opportunity to teach the apostles, to teach the 12 about what it truly means to follow him. He's starting to take these lessons for them a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. Because he's starting to prepare them now for taking over when he's gone. That's his purpose in preparing these guys, because he knows that when he leaves this group, these guys are going to be the ones to carry on. And so he's got to start to take their training a little bit deeper, a little bit further. You can't just keep it on the surface. And he uses these sorts of examples and these sorts of interactions to take them the next step. because now he's going to go really, really, really deep, and we've got time to do this. Who would like to read 28 through 33 for me? Joanne, go for it.
This food the Son of Man will give you, for it is upon whom God the Father has set the seal of his authority. Then what must we do? They asked him, if we are to work as God would have us work. Jesus replied, this is the work that God requires. Believe in the one whom he has sent. They said, what sign can you give us to see so that we may believe you? What is the work you do? Our ancestors had manna to eat in the desert, as scripture says, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus answered, I tell you this, the truth is not that Moses gave you the bread from heaven, but that my Father gives you the real bread from heaven. The bread that God gives comes down from heaven and brings life to the world. How much further?
That's good, right there. I love the response. What do we have to do? What's the work that God requires of us? And Jesus simply said, believe in the one he sent. Sounds simple enough, right? Believe in the one he sent. And their immediate response is, well, what miracle are you going to show us so that we know you're the one? He's been healing people left and right. He's fed 15 to 20,000 people with just a little tiny food. And now they're going, what else are you going to do for us? What more can you show us? And they went back to what had happened as the Israelites were going through the wilderness on their way out of Egypt into the promised land. Well, Moses gave us manna from heaven. They wanted something, again, tangible, something that they didn't have to work for, and something that would satisfy a very basic physical human need. They wanted to be fed again. And they wanted it to keep coming. And Jesus is shifting gears here now. He's not going to be talking about physical bread. He's going to be talking about something on a deeper plane, something spiritual. But we've seen time and time again, how the people misconstrue things that Jesus is saying, because they're only looking at it from that physical plane, that physical point of view. And so Jesus talks about the bread of God that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. I'm going to stop there because this whole next section gets pretty deep and we want to take some time into it. But I wanted to just kind of plant that seed as we're seeing this shift now. Is Jesus is going to be talking about something profoundly spiritual. And the people aren't going to understand what he's saying. In fact, it's going to get so complicated for them and so difficult that most of them are going to simply turn and walk away. Because he's going to start talking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And if you're only following Jesus for those superficial reasons, that could get a little scary, could get a little difficult. But this is a continuation, this discourse of Jesus being the bread of life. It's really a continuation of the feeding of the 5,000. That kind of was the impetus for this teaching down the road. And as I said at the end of last week, kind of as a preface, Jesus's first miracle was changing water into wine. This miracle, the one that's going to be a turning point for the disciples' education, is really about him being the bread of life. So we've got the wine, we've got the bread, and theologically, what does that construe for us?
It's our communion. It's our Eucharist.
Communion. Yeah, it's the Eucharist. But it's also on a deeper spiritual level, his broken body and his shed blood, not just in the elements of communion, but as the means for forgiveness.
Salvation.
It's salvation. Yeah. That's where he's taking this. Communion is a way that we celebrate that, but he's taking it even deeper than just the Eucharist. But it's also going to cause problems for people because they're not going to understand. And that's okay, because he doesn't try to convince them to stay. When the crowds turn and walk away, he simply lets them go because they're not ready to understand yet. The only people he's really concerned about through all of this are the disciples. Because at the end of this discourse, he's going to turn to the 12 and say, well, everybody else is leaving. What about you? Because at this point, it really is about them. He's taking their teaching on a whole different plane. He's trying to get them to look beyond just the physical aspect of it and take it to that next place where it comes to be deeper. It comes to be about salvation. The other thing to do is to look at this and how John has structured all of this. John quite frequently uses a literary technique that was really popular in Hebrew literature. The technical term is inclusio. I kind of think of it as parentheses. The normal way that it would happen is they would introduce a topic here, have a bunch of other stuff, and then bring that same topic back around here like they're bracketing it. And so what you've got is the introduction, the conclusion, and all of this stuff that comes in between. And so it's meant to take that as a separate chunk out of the whole. Well, John is kind of doing it here in a little more subtle way. He's talking about the water into wine. He's talking about the bread of life. He's talking about those elements of the Eucharist, also the things that bring us salvation. And then we've got all of this other stuff that comes in between. And most of that stuff early on was having to do with the healings, the miracles. But in John's style, what he's saying is that the things that are important, the wine, the bread, the blood, the body, and all of the stuff that comes in between is a result of this, or an explanation of the bracketing at either end. So for John, the important part through this whole section aren't the miracles, aren't the healings. It's about salvation and how we attain it. I love that. It's subtle, but we're going to see it again a little bit later on about how he uses that method to really enforce what it is he's trying to teach. The takeaway from all of this is that Jesus is now going to start to shift gears. We already saw before that you had the Pharisees who were dead set against him. They didn't like him, and they were angry, and they were looking for ways to get rid of him, to shut him up. And so for the next year, Jesus is going to be having this tap dance, if you will, with the Pharisees and the religious leaders, all the while bringing his disciples, that core group, closer and closer along in this dance, and getting it to the point where they are going to step in and be the partners for Jesus. As Jesus exits the dance, you're going to have the apostles who are going to be the ones to step in and take his place. So kind of keep that analogy in the back of your head as we're going through the rest of this story. It's becoming a dance. Make sense? Or is it total confusion?
No, it does. It makes sense.
A little bit of both, actually. Any questions, comments, concerns? It's a lot to throw out in just an hour.
It is.
Gives us something to ponder, something to think about, and something to remind us that in the midst of the storm, please let Jesus into the boat. Don't make him walk alongside on top of the waves. Let him into the boat.
And don't talk so much that you don't listen.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been accused of that, but
No, no.
but I will listen. If you have something to say, I will listen because I love what you guys bring.
I wasn't directing that at you.
I know. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, Helen.
I'm kind of relieved that I'm not the only one who feels like I might not get things the first time, you know. So the disciples and a lot of people didn't either.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Because how are we supposed to understand?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like
How?
nothing that came before.
Yeah. But yet it's like everything that came before. And that to me is the fascinating part. It's like God has been talking about this for hundreds of years. But yet when it finally shows up, they have no clue. They have no clue. I kind of look at it like, you know, for the first 2,000 years of eternity, I'm going to walk around with a giant palm print on my forehead from going, well, duh. That's what it was. That's what you said. That's what you meant. And, you know, this whole time is like a giant palm print for everybody going, well, duh. Even though Jesus keeps pointing it out along the way that this is what's happened. This is what God has done. This is what we've known all along. When it's finally there, they just don't quite understand. But he doesn't give up. That's what I like. He doesn't give up on us either. Well, I'm going to give up. I'm going to shut up. I'm going to stop talking because otherwise we're going to jump right into the next part and it's going to get ugly because Susan will stare at me that I'm gone too long and you guys can't pray. So have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.